In early 1943, northern Manchuria was wrapped in cold and silence. The war in the Pacific had been raging for 2 years, but here, far from the naval fronts, everything seemed still. There were no battles, no explosions, only snow, long stretches of railway, and the monotonous rhythm of military garrisons. In these remote regions, the war felt less like motion and more like waiting. Captain Kenji Imura had served in the Kwantung Army since the late 1932nd. A career officer, he was known for his discipline and precision. His post was not a combat one. He oversaw internal investigations, ensured loyalty, and monitored the execution of orders. His department, small but methodical, was attached to the Harbin Garrison headquarters. Each day began the same way: reports, summaries, verification of archives, and the signing of official statements. For him, the war existed as statistics. Numbers arrived from different fronts, were entered into tables, and passed through his hands before being sent onward. Everything followed an order, carefully documented. Imura believed that order and paperwork were the only structures capable of preserving meaning amid the chaos of war. By the spring of 1943, however, he began to sense that this order was fracturing. Orders grew contradictory, reports less reliable. Figures on the page no longer matched reality. Prisoners listed as 5 turned out to be 2. Convoy manifests changed en route. Crates disappeared. Records were lost. Everything was summarized as unconfirmed circumstances. Imura asked no questions. He understood that paying too much attention to detail was seen as suspicion, and suspicion in the military bordered on disobedience. Still, he could not ignore the feeling that behind the numbers lay something more than clerical error. In May, a new file arrived on his desk. It was sealed and marked confidential. The accompanying note read, "Detained German national, suspected spy, connected to foreign intelligence." The name was Friedrich Lang, a German engineer who had worked at a civilian plant in Harbin. The order instructed that a brief investigation be conducted, and the prescribed punishment carried out execution by firing squad. The document bore the seal of the Kwantung Army headquarters and an unfamiliar signature. It had been drafted hastily. No interrogation transcripts, no witness statements. Several pages were missing entirely. Checking the archive, Imura found that Lange had been under Japanese jurisdiction for over a month. During that time, no reports of questioning or evidence had been filed. Officially, he was already condemned, yet without a trial, without legal standing. In the system's records, he existed only as a number, awaiting deletion. Imura wrote a short memorandum requesting clarification of the circumstances and sent it up the chain of command. The reply came the next day. No intervention required. Execute without delay. The signature was the same, a single character, "Say," meaning approved. That was the moment the first real doubt appeared. Until then, every act he had performed seemed justified by duty. But this document contradicted the very principle he believed in. An execution without confirmation of guilt was not law, it was elimination for the sake of convenience. He spoke to no one about it. Instead, he delayed the order for 24 hours, citing administrative reasons. That alone was enough to draw attention. The following day, an officer from counterintelligence arrived. Imura was given a verbal reprimand and reminded of his obligation to obey. That night, he remained in his office long after curfew. The lamp burned dimly. The radio whispered static against the sound of wind outside. Snow fell past the window, each flake settling on the sill like a fragment of time. The air smelled of kerosene and paper. He read the order again and realized it was no longer just a document. It was a boundary, the line beyond which his understanding of order no longer applied. In the archive, he located an older file. It confirmed that engineer Lange had once worked as a consultant at an industrial facility cooperating with Japanese firms. By all formal criteria, he could not have been a spy. He had no access to classified material, and no ties to the military. Yet such people often became scapegoats, condemned not for what they had done, but because the system required names and outcomes. Imura knew that refusal would be seen as defiance, but within him, a realization took root. Obedience itself had become a form of participation in destruction. He did not intend to absolve the man, but he could not sign a death warrant that lacked reason. The next morning, he sent an official request to suspend the execution until verification could be made. He understood that once he did this, there would be no return. The reply did not come immediately. 2 days passed in silence. On the third evening, he was summoned to the central office. No one explained why, but the atmosphere left little doubt. Imura did not resist. He understood that he had crossed from observer to subject, from one who documented events to one who would now become an entry in someone else's report. That night, the snow continued to fall. The radio hissed quietly in the corner, and somewhere in the archive, among gray folders and fading seals, there lay a single file with a name that no one would ever mention again. After being summoned to headquarters, Captain Imura expected formal punishment, but no disciplinary action followed. He was neither arrested nor removed from his post. Instead, he was temporarily reassigned to oversee the archives of the Internal Security Division, a position responsible for maintaining classified documents and operational records. It was a peculiar decision, but within the Army's structure, such transfers were often used as a quiet method of surveillance, a way to isolate a person without creating open scandal. The archive building stood on the outskirts of Harbin. It was constructed from gray brick, its windows narrow, its doors reinforced with iron. Inside, the air smelled of dust, paper, and cold. There was no telephone line, only written reports delivered by couriers. Each morning, Imura entered his small office, where folders were neatly stacked on the desk. Most of the documents were interrogation records, lists of suspects, and surveillance summaries. Each file was written in the same detached, bureaucratic tone. Together, they described the lives of people reduced to statistics. Imura read them not as individual stories, but as evidence of a system that measured existence through data and control. Among the files, he noticed several older folders sealed with the red stamp of the Counterintelligence Bureau. They contained information on individuals deemed unreliable. In one of them, he found the name of Friedrich Lang crossed out in red pencil. In the status column was a single word: deferred. In bureaucratic language, it meant that a decision had been postponed, but in practice, such a mark almost always preceded final elimination. Imura realized that his earlier interference had changed nothing. It had merely delayed an outcome that was already inevitable. Yet the system showed him no hostility. Instead, it surrounded him with silence. No reprimands, no further orders, only a deliberate absence of contact, as if he had ceased to exist. With each passing day, his surroundings felt increasingly abstract. The work continued, but the meaning behind it dissolved. He compiled reports, checked document numbers, verified signatures. It was all mechanical, an imitation of order, designed to preserve the appearance of control. By autumn 1943, internal inspections intensified. A special commission arrived from the district headquarters to identify disciplinary deviations among officers and enlisted men. In practice, this meant the beginning of a purge aimed at those who hesitated. Imura attended several sessions. Around the tables sat officers in identical uniforms, reading statements in flat voices. Their words resembled the texture of a transcript, linear, factual, devoid of tone. After each session, reports were signed and names were recorded. Those names never appeared again. He performed his duties with precision, but without initiative. Any personal interpretation could be seen as a sign of disloyalty. His reports were factual, verifiable, and empty of opinion. Everything beyond that remained unwritten. In December, a new order arrived at the archive to conduct a review of obsolete materials and destroy documents deemed irrelevant. Imura understood what it truly meant, an effort to erase internal correspondence and prior inconsistencies. He compiled the required list but deliberately excluded one folder, the file of Friedrich Lang. He removed it from the archive and hid it among his personal notes. Technically, it was a violation of procedure, but no one inspected his desk. The folder remained there, quietly buried beneath unused forms. At times, he would take it out and reread the pages. Each line, each empty signature box, seemed to reflect the structure of the entire system, precise yet meaningless. Everything written there could have described anyone. As winter approached, security restrictions tightened. Radio broadcasts were shortened. Letters were intercepted and reviewed by multiple offices before delivery. At night, patrols marched through the frozen streets, their footsteps echoing against the walls. Harbin had become a city of observation, where every movement could be recorded and every silence could be interpreted. Imura increasingly felt as if he were living inside a report, not as a man, but as an entry in someone else's file. His days repeated with mechanical precision. Morning summaries, document checks, evening notes in the logbook. The distinction between dates, people, and events began to fade. It seemed to him that the structure of the army itself had transformed into a machine without purpose. Orders were still issued, but they carried no meaning. People followed them automatically, because form had replaced reason. At the end of January, he received a notice of reassignment, this time to the district headquarters Internal Security Bureau. Officially, it was a promotion. In reality, it was another form of control. His new role was to oversee other officers, to collect data on their conduct, and evaluate their discipline. The irony was evident. A man whose loyalty had quietly come into question was now tasked with measuring the loyalty of others. His job was to write profiles, observe behavior, and record suspicions. Thus, the observer became both participant and subject. He worked quietly, without comment. Each evening, he returned to his small room and made brief entries in a notebook. These notes contained no reflections, only dates, report numbers, and short phrases. Inspection complete. Files transferred. Statement signed. In mid-February 1944, a summons arrived. It was phrased in the usual administrative language, report for verification of service data. In such cases, the decision had almost always been made in advance. On the appointed day, he arrived at the exact hour. The corridors were empty and still. The interrogation room was cold and smelled of metal and paper. Across the table sat an officer wearing a uniform without insignia. On the desk lay a thin folder. Imura understood immediately that within those few pages was everything the system required. The interrogation lasted several hours. The questions were delivered in the same bureaucratic tone as the documents Captain Imura had spent his career reading. There were no threats, but the logic behind them was already predetermined. Every answer existed in advance, requiring only the correct phrasing to be recorded on paper. The officer sitting across from him did not give his name. He made short notes, his eyes fixed on the page. Occasionally, he asked for dates or confirmation of orders, but his inquiries were not aimed at truth. They served only to complete the form to ensure the report contained no empty fields. Imura understood that the purpose of this process was not to examine his actions, but to formalize his existence within a new category, disciplinary violation. In a system where every event required documentation, he had become an error to be corrected. When the interrogation ended, he was not detained. He was instructed to continue his duties until further notice. No official order arrived the next day, nor the next week. He returned to the archive, where everything remained as before. The folders, the desk, the faint yellow light unchanged. Yet the silence around him had taken on a new quality. Every sound, every movement, every piece of paper felt like part of surveillance. He knew he was being observed not by individuals, but by the system itself, which allowed no one to exist beyond its boundaries. In the following weeks, he carried out his work as usual, yet the documents passing through his hands began to resemble mirrors. They contained familiar phrases, verified for reliability, preliminarily noted, subject to review. Each line echoed his own position, the slow transformation of a man into a precedent. By spring, personnel changes began throughout the headquarters. Officially, they were described as structural adjustments. In reality, dozens of officers disappeared from the records. Their files were sealed, their names replaced by serial numbers. Imura was reassigned to a small outpost in the northern province. The place appeared forgotten. A few wooden barracks, a radio station, a supply shed. There were no interrogations there, no inspections. His new task was to maintain the communication log and monitor radio transmissions. It was not punishment nor reward. It was administrative isolation under the appearance of service. The days passed identically. Each morning he recorded weather data and signal strength. During the day, he checked maps and outdated papers. In the evening, he wrote a brief report and sent it through the chain of command. Everything functioned with precision, but the precision had lost its meaning. At night, he sometimes tuned the radio to foreign frequencies. He caught fragments of German speech, distorted signals, and faint music. These sounds seemed alive, random, and uncontrolled. Amid the static of the garrison, they felt like reminders that somewhere beyond this frozen silence, the world still moved. In early April, a new order arrived. It concerned the re-evaluation of officers in auxiliary posts. Imura was instructed to appear before a commission for review. The language was formal, but final. He arrived at the designated hour. In the room sat 3 officers behind a table. Before them lay a thin folder. Inside were copies of the same documents he had seen before, the order he had refused to carry out, his performance evaluations, reports from counterintelligence. Everything was arranged perfectly, as though the purpose was not judgment, but administrative completion. A regulation was read aloud. Failure to comply with direct orders constitutes disruption of service integrity. Then followed an official statement confirming the breach of discipline. Signatures were added one by one, slowly, deliberately, without expression. When the signing was complete, Imura was informed that the decision took immediate effect. He asked no questions. The process was finished, and within its logic there was no room for explanation. After the session, he was escorted to an adjoining room. An officer without insignia read a brief directive, demotion in rank, and transfer to the jurisdiction of a military tribunal. The words were delivered mechanically, as though this were a continuation of routine paperwork. That evening, he was placed in a small room with no windows. On the table lay a folder, his personal file. Inside was a familiar document, the case of Friedrich Lange. The word deferred had been crossed out. Beneath it, a new notation had been added. Executed. That line was the final confirmation of everything that had happened. Imura realized that the doubt he had once allowed had now become a part of the same structure as the order he had refused to sign. A few days later, he was transported back to the garrison where he had previously served. Near the edge of the compound was an open field used for drills. At dawn, a light fog hung over the ground. There were no crowds, no commands, only the dull chill of the morning and the smell of wet soil. The paperwork completed the day before listed every detail, date, file number, reason. His name appeared among others, those approved for execution. In the final moments, he felt no fear. What was happening felt like the natural conclusion of a sequence that had begun with his decision to refuse a meaningless order. There was no drama in the end. No words were necessary. Everything had already been written in reports, in memos, in ledgers. Later, a new file appeared in the Harbin archives. In the subject line it read, "Concerning failure to execute order and disruption of discipline." In the status field was a single word, executed. Beneath it, a date and a stamp. The folder was placed neatly in a cabinet beside others of identical size and color. On its cover was a number 471B. No name, No notes, no explanation, only registration. The system had completed its cycle. It recorded the fact, formalized it, approved it, and moved on to the next. In the empty office where Imura had once worked, the lamp still stood on the desk. Dust had gathered on its glass. Beneath it lay a notebook containing his final entry. It read, "When a system destroys doubt, it destroys memory. When memory disappears, the human being disappears with it." The lamp continued to burn for several days until it was replaced during a scheduled inspection. The office was sealed, his belongings sent to storage. A month later, a brief note appeared in the headquarters report. Structural adjustments completed. No irregularities detected. Thus ended the story of an officer whose only act, the refusal to carry out a senseless order, became evidence that, in any system, order outweighs truth. His name, once written in the margins of another man's report, vanished into the same ledgers he had once maintained.